I'm glad to be back. I spent a lot of years in San Diego County working on water quality issues and doing educational meetings and that sort of thing for both the Farm Bureau, the Cooperative Extension, and as an advisor here. And it was a great time as far as getting people up to speed with regard to what the requirements were and that sort of thing when the requirements were becoming pretty onerous and involved. So I'm glad to be back. Hopefully I can be of some help to you all and make sure that you all get your annual education. I'm also more than happy to answer questions at the end of my presentation and before Dr. Spinelli takes over. And at the end of our presentation, we will have time when both of us will be here to answer any of the questions that you might have. So with that being said, I'm going to get started. My part of this presentation is to give you a little bit of history of water quality laws and regulations and how they have come about to the point where we are today with regard to requiring that we monitor our water quality and take great care in dealing with what goes into our waterways and that sort of thing from our agricultural operations. So first of all, before I start on the laws and all of that, I wanted to just mention that I'm sure you're all very familiar with the water situation in California, and it's really been a difficult situation since California began as far as water availability and who gets to use the water, how we move water around the state and that sort of thing. We really don't have much of our own water in Southern California, so we've spent a lot of time coming up with plans and a lot of money coming up with plans to move water into Southern California so that we can maintain both our urban and our agricultural sectors here. And that has set the stage for a lot of additional water quality and water rights and water use requirements and laws and regulations in Southern California. We seem to have either too little water, which seems to be more frequent than too much water, but there have been times where we've had way too much water that we've been really struggling to deal with. Some of that's happened in the last few years. But we generally don't come up with just a regular decent amount of water that we can use on a normal basis without having to do quite a lot to it. Because of the fact that water is somewhat inconsistent and we don't have an unlimited amount to use, we have to take great care in managing the water that we do have and making sure that it isn't polluted with nitrates or other things or any other possible pollutant that can get into the waterways has been a real focus of the regulatory system here. So that's just something you probably are all aware of, that we don't always have enough water, but just laying the groundwork a little bit for why we have all these laws and regulations is pretty important. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about water laws include water use and water quality. So water use laws, as you know, are changing on a regular basis depending on how much we have available at the time. It depends on what the water source is, where we're getting it. We generally get our water either from Northern California or we get our water from the Colorado River. And depending on the supply, rules are put in place as to how we can use that and how much we get any particular year and that sort of thing. These usually start with federal laws. There are 3 tiers of laws, and they begin with the federal laws, which are generally very broad-reaching, and they mostly deal with protection of water and the species that are associated with it. And that's a really important point. So federal laws are comprehensive, and they don't necessarily look at very specific items within water quality. The species associated with it are a real driving factor in water quality and how the water quality laws are put in place because those species are protected. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through. The state laws are below the federal laws, and they have to uphold the federal laws at a minimum. They can be more stringent than federal laws, but they are specific to what state requirements are required, and a lot of state geography, geology, that sort of thing is part of how state laws are put together, because there will be different water quality requirements in different areas and different states. This deals with both allocation and water quality. And then you get down to the local level, and there are local laws that can be more stringent than the state laws and more stringent than the federal laws. And they generally deal with a specific scenario at the local level. Okay. Real specifically here, federal laws provide the establishment of federal departments, such as the EPA. They act as an umbrella for state and local implementation of water programs. So there are federal water programs. Sometimes the federal laws provide funding opportunities for implementation of things, that sort of thing, but they don't necessarily implement on a very minor local level. What happens is that state laws, that the federal government passes this responsibility down to the states. And state laws and programs provide basically a home for federal water law enforcement. And they can also provide laws specific just to California. And they can also provide state programs and state boards and plans that are specific to the state of California. You might also all be familiar with the State Water Quality Control Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. Those are state of California programs, and those are, they are managed and all by the state of California. Local laws then provide specific compliance for project development, for codes, for requirements for local jurisdictions. Some cities have very specific requirements that they need. A county government may have specific requirements. And a specific region of the Regional Water Quality Control Board may have specific programs that they implement. But basically, it all starts with the federal government, and they pass the responsibility down to the state, and the state ultimately passes the responsibility for enforcement down to maybe a local level. And at each step of the way, there can be additional laws and regulations that come into play that are more stringent than the one above it. Okay, so from a chronological point of view, and how did we get to where we are today? A lot of things happened after World War II. In the 1940s to the 1960s, a lot of federal laws changed, and there were a lot of environmental laws that came into play. So from the 1940s to the 1960s, federal law provided largely for funding of water treatment plants and voluntary minimization of pollution by large polluters. And often this was unsuccessful. So when we started to have additional population centers that were growing, we needed water treatment plants to make sure that the municipal water supplies were in good shape and that sort of thing. And a lot of federal laws and federal money went to implementation of that. And then the voluntary minimization of pollution by large polluters. Generally, these were post-war factories. The finger is always pointed at the post-war factories and in other steel mills and that sort of thing, big, large industrial polluters. Generally, they were encouraged to not pollute, and it was a voluntary minimization of pollution, but it didn't really work out very well. One of the turning points in all of this was when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which was a classic book that talked about the impact on species of the pollution that was occurring in our environment and in the water quality area. And it was a real turning point with regard to how everyone looked at environmental laws and regulations. And subsequent to that, there were a whole slew of laws and regulations that were written, and one followed another. Starting in 1965, the Water Quality Act, and in 1966, the Clean Water Act established the Water Pollution Control Administration, and this was within the Department of the Interior at the time. So the Water Quality Act was the initial Water Quality Act, and the Clean Water Act was the initial federal specific Clean Water Act for pollution control in the 1960s. And then in 1968, they followed that with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which requires a certain amount of water to be maintained in rivers so that they can maintain their species and so that they can maintain a specific dilution of pollutants and that sort of thing. And the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is still something that really impacts us a lot in California today, because we are required to put a certain amount of water into the rivers. They're part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And that adds up to be a very large percentage of the water that we have available in California. And we just, that's accounted for already. We just, it goes out to the rivers, and we just don't discuss it anymore at this point in time. But it is a very large amount of the water that California has. Okay, so one of the things that we have always noticed is the fact that California is a very strong leader in the regulatory programs, and I'm specifically talking about water quality, but in environmental regulations. California oftentimes leads the federal government, and California established the Port of Cologne Act in 1969. So this is a state act. It's not a federal law, it's state of California. And what it did was that it established a program to protect water quality and the beneficial uses. And so there are specific things that are listed as beneficial uses for water. There's a whole list of them, and the use for agriculture is one of the beneficial uses. The use for human consumption is another beneficial use. Protection of species is another beneficial use. So there's a whole list of these beneficial uses. And this Port of Cologne Act then was established to protect water quality so that we could continue to have good quality water for all these beneficial uses for the water. And this particular act applies to both surface and groundwater, which is something that you may not see as we go through this discussion today, that primarily what we're talking about with the irrigated lands groups is specific to surface water. But this Port of Cologne Act did deal with both surface and groundwater, and it established the State Water Control Board, State Water Resources Control Board, and the 9 regional water quality control boards in California. So we are in Region 9. We are the southernmost region in California. And you might notice, if you, in your spare time, look at the regional board regions, you can see that they do not fit within a county boundary. The regional board regions are determined based on drainages. And so in the Region 9 that we are in, we have a little bit of Riverside County and a little bit of Orange County also, and not all of San Diego County. So the eastern part of San Diego County is in the region with the Imperial Valley, and the rest of Orange County and the rest of Riverside County are in separate regions. So, and it depends on the way the water flows. And that is because the water quality is really determined by the flow of the rivers and the streams and that sort of thing as they go out to the ocean. So our region is about 2/3 of San Diego County, a little bit of Orange County, and a little bit of Riverside County. Okay, so 3 years after California developed the Port of Cologne Act, the federal government decided it looked pretty good, and they thought they would put something together similar to that. It's very common, like I said, for California to be sort of a guinea pig with environmental regulations, and then the federal government might follow with something similar, that maybe they fixed something that didn't work well, but they tried it out in California, because there's so much in California that so many different climate zones, so many different population areas and that sort of thing. It's a really good place to try out some of these things. So the Federal Clean Water Act definitely was modeled after the Port of Cologne Act. It is the principal federal statute for water quality protection, and this was in 1972. What it primarily was supposed to deal with is what's called point source pollution. Point source pollution has an easily identifiable source. So there's a point at which you can see the pollution flowing out the end of a pipe into a river, into a stream, into the ocean, what have you, into a water body. Point source pollution was the original water quality concern, and it was thought that if we could get point sources of pollution under control, then the water quality issues would diminish greatly. And this program and this water quality law, the original Federal Clean Water Act, was somewhat successful, but it was still surprisingly not as successful as it was thought it would be. So there was additional review of this, and what happened after this was a few more rules. The Federal Coastal Zone Management Act came into place too. This is another federal law. What it does is it regulates activities occurring in the coastal zone. And the coastal zone is, from a water quality point of view, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of different coastal ecosystems there. They are somewhat fragile in some regards. And so there has to be a method for handling any kind of water pollutants that flow into a coastal zone area. And a lot of them take real specific and individual management. So it required that the states develop coastal management plans. So the federal government wrote this act, the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, and what the requirement was that the states have to deal with it, and they had to develop their own coastal management plans. So what happens with this is that this works through the California Coastal Commission and the State Coastal Conservancy, and you probably are familiar with both of them. They've had a big impact on water quality. Every time you hear about beach problems and that sort of thing, the Coastal Commission and sometimes the State Coastal Conservancy may be involved in this. State Coastal Conservancy is more involved in planning and how you go about planning in areas of the coastal areas. And the Coastal Commission is a little bit more involved in the day-to-day type activities and how the rules will be put forward for that. A lot of agriculture ultimately has runoff that flows into coastal areas if it's not retained. And so this is where the implications come from the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act for ag. And in San Diego County, of course, historically, a lot of our agriculture was in the coastal areas in Carlsbad and Encinitas and that area with regard to the nursery industry. It had big implications for impacting the coastal zone. And so this Federal Coastal Zone Management Act had a lot to do with San Diego agriculture for a period of time. All right. The next year, the federal government was on a roll, and they put together the Federal Endangered Species Act. This was administered by the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, terrestrial and freshwater species, and the National Marine Fisheries Service for the marine species. So the on land and in the ocean species are separated by a regulatory program. So the Fish and Wildlife Service does not deal with fisheries that are in the ocean. What this does is protect native plants and animals that are in danger of extinction. And more importantly, from the point of view of how this has implications for ag and for the nursery industry, for any of the agricultural programs and projects that are going on and any kind of grower practices, this also affects their habitat. So it protects native plants and animals, and it protects any kind of habitat that may have implications for a reduction in the numbers of the animals or the native plants that are endangered. So this is a difficult situation because a lot of things, a lot of practices in agriculture and also in other kinds of activities, whether it's development, construction, what have you, could have a really big impact on the endangered species. And there are specific species in our area that have been listed as endangered. San Diego County is the richest area in the US, I believe, still considered that as far as having a variety of species, which makes it even more difficult it's a great thing, but it makes it more difficult to protect all of the habitat because there are so many different things that have to be looked at. Habitat conservation planning is required of landowners with threatened and endangered species on their property. And if you happen to be a grower, rancher, farmer, and you happen to have endangered species, whether plant or animal on your property or habitat on your property, whether you have the species or not, if the habitat is there, that is protected. So if you have never seen the species itself, the animal species itself, but you do have habitat, you still have to take the steps to protect that. So that is the Federal Endangered Species Act. And again, there is a follow-up to that, which is the California Endangered Species Act that has specific species located in California that are considered endangered, and those have additional requirements. So not only is there a Federal Endangered Species Act, but there are species that are California endangered, and we have to deal with them in a very similar manner. So a lot of that has implications for ag. All right, so now we're getting closer to the water quality part of all of this. The Clean Water Act reauthorization amendments. So first of all, we had the Clean Water Act in 1972, and that's the first thing that really got things rolling as far as water quality is concerned. And then the Clean Water Act reauthorization amendments came about in 1987. And the reason this came about was because we realized that just dealing with point sources of pollution really wasn't cutting it. It wasn't really cleaning the water supplies up as much as we thought it would. There was something else that had to be done in order to make sure that the water supply and the water, the streams and rivers and that sort of thing were not becoming additionally polluted as they flowed downstream. So, and that's what was picked up upon, is that a water body, whether it be a stream or a river, would be reasonably pollution free upstream, but a few miles downstream without any real specific designated location where you could say that pollution was running into the river or the stream. Ultimately, it was not as clean downstream as it was upstream. So at some point along there were sources of pollutants that were getting into the water. And so it's very difficult to deal with this because you can't pinpoint exactly what it is. So that's called non-point source pollution. It's pollution that does not have an identifiable source, but you know that the river or the stream is not as clean downstream as it was upstream. So there is something getting in there along the way that's causing this degradation of water quality. This is the law that really started the current trend of ag water quality regulation that affects you as growers. So really this started in 1987. I started as a farm advisor in 1990, and that was about the time this was being implemented. And I pretty much worked on that my entire career as a farm advisor from 1990 to 2012, when I ended up leaving Cooperative Extension and going north to Pomona. But it was an evolving sort of situation, but hopefully we were able to assist a little bit in helping to write the regulations with the regional board and that sort of thing to make it possible for the growers to actually implement some of these things that they needed to implement. Okay, so again, going through the California water laws and regs, because these are additional things that came up. As you're catching on here real quickly, you can see that we have a lot of rules and a lot of regulations and a lot of laws that pertain to the environment and specifically to water. Porter Cologne Act I mentioned was in 1969. It came before the original Clean Water Act in 1972. And it was followed in California by the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which you've all heard about when it comes to any kind of a project or development that's going in. It has to go through a CEQA process. And what a CEQA process is a review of the environmental quality that will change by implementation of a specific project. It might require an environmental impact review, may or may not. So CEQA is something that's advisory and it does not have to be followed, but it has to be completed. So at least the information is there for decision making. In 1976, California developed its own Coastal Act, and it authorized the California Coastal Commission to implement federal laws. Okay. All right, hold on. Some of these bars are in my words here. So, okay. So as a grower, what laws and regulations will affect you? There are a number of things that will affect you. And a lot of these have already been started in San Diego County. We've been working on these for a number of years. There are federal and state laws and programs, and some of these, whoops, sorry, let me go back one. Federal and state laws and programs, there's a number of each of these that will affect you directly as a grower. One of them is the 303D list and the total maximum daily load, or TMDL programs. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The stormwater permit, annual inspections by Ag Weights and Measures, or your local municipality. Dr. Spinelli is going to talk a little bit more about this in his presentation. Sitting right next to me here, and he's going to take over when I'm finished here. The Ag Waiver program that you're all familiar with and that you're participating in at this point in time. And there are things called pesticide management zones protecting groundwater. Those are not in San Diego County. We don't have any in San Diego County. To the best of my knowledge, I couldn't find any in the literature. So a pesticide management zone is an area where groundwater has been contaminated and it has to be free of application of specific pesticides within a mile radius of that, but we don't have any of those in San Diego County. A lot of these are up in the Valley area, Central Valley area, and that is something that we have not had to deal with here. Some of these are federal laws, but they are implemented and enforced by state or local agencies. So that's the trend, and that is how most of this goes. All right, so one of the more impactful programs with regard to water quality that came up in the last many years was the TMDL program and the 303D list. So, and how the 303D list is associated with TMDL program. So TMDL again stands for total maximum daily load, which means that is the amount of a particular pollutant that a water body can accept in a day's period without having environmental degradation that is too great, okay? So there's a level that's acceptable, and beyond that level, it has to be managed. So federal laws require that each state put together a list of impaired water bodies that exceed the levels of pollution that are acceptable, okay? Water bodies are placed on a list after a hearing where data is presented and a case is made to show the pollution levels. And the governor signs off on the list every couple of years. It's true, water bodies can go on to the list, but they can also come off the list if they end up with a good cleanup effort and the water quality has improved. So a little bit more about this. The impaired water bodies, the 303D designation refers to section 303D of the water quality law that specifies this. Okay, so that's the non-point source pollution, the reauthorization amendments of 1987. So this is part of that law, and the 303D list is specified as something that has to be done. All right, so when these water bodies are placed on a list, they can be an entire water body, say an entire lake, if it shows that it's got pollutant levels of concern throughout the lake. It can be a very small stretch of beach on the coast, maybe a quarter of a mile long. It can be a portion of a river, it can be a portion of a stream, what have you, but it's a specific location where pollutants are shown to be in high levels and basically action needs to be done. So there's a hearing. I've attended these hearings to see what the information is that supports the fact that this needs to be considered a impaired water body and be put on this 303D list. And then every 2 years, the governor will sign off on this list and say, yes, this is what we need to work on at this point in time. So that's how the 303D list is put together. And there can be various groups that will get something on the 303D list. Most of the time, they are some kind of group that is concerned with water quality. It can be a city, it can be a group of concerned citizens, it can be a nonprofit, what have you, but they have to do the science to present the data showing that this water body is indeed impaired and it should be placed on this list. All right, so the water bodies that are on the 303D list then become part of what's called the total maximum daily load process. So let's say we have 50 water bodies on the 303D list. Some of them will have more of a need to be cleaned up than others. Some of them will be less of a priority, but this is all based on the beneficial uses of that particular water body. Let's say we have a stretch of the beach that is a heavy recreational use beach, and that one is a beneficial use. Absolutely, recreation is considered a beneficial use, and we realize that there are going to be some implications for population, maybe having issues with too much bacteria. So there would be a total maximum daily load process put into place to clean up that section of that particular water body. It can be any pollutant you're talking about, nitrates, it can be bacteria, it can be other, it can be a pesticide material, what have you. There's any number of things that can be considered a pollutant that would fall into this category of requiring a cleanup plan and getting it on the 303D list. Okay, so what's involved in the TMDL process? A specific pollutant or set of pollutants that have been identified for a stream. I'm going to use stream as the example here, but it can be a lake, it can be a beach, a stretch of beach, what have you. Let's say it's a stream, it's targeted for cleanup. The levels that need to be attained are set by our local regional water quality control board staff. This is an area where it can be difficult because sometimes the levels that need to be attained are exceedingly low, and it's a very hard thing to get to that point. A stakeholder-driven plan for cleanup is put together, and it must be okayed by higher-up agencies. So the stakeholder plan can be driven by a community group. It can be driven by the Farm Bureau or some group like that if they chose to get involved in it. I don't believe that the Farm Bureau has in San Diego, but sometimes things like that occur. The stakeholders involved in this put together a plan for cleaning it up, and that means generally changes in best management practices or increased best management practices that will minimize anything flowing off property and into this water body. The timetable is about 1 to 2 years for development of a plan, and it can be for 15 to 20 years or so for implementation, even as high as 25 years. So it's a long-term effort, and it needs to be monitored along the way. So plans can be revisited for changes during the implementation phase. So perhaps if the numbers that were trying to be reached were far too stringent and impossible, that may be altered. May not be. It may be something that's always trying to be attained. So an example of this was the very first one. I did work on this when I was a farm advisor, and that was for Rainbow Creek in northern San Diego County. It was the first TMDL that was developed in San Diego, and it was for nitrogen and phosphorus and directly related to the agricultural industry in those areas. So this was a very difficult situation because the numbers that were supposed to be achieved as far as the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus were exceptionally low, and it was very hard to meet that. So that is still underway as far as the implementation is concerned. But this is something that if there is a TMDL and it is in your area and it may have implications for what you're doing as a farmer or as a grower, it's very wise to get involved, because with the way that these things can turn out may have big implications for how you do your farming. All right, now we're gonna, whoop, oh boy, hold on a minute. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about stormwater permits. This is one of the biggest efforts in recent years, and most of you have had inspections. So when we talk about stormwater permits, what we're really talking about for the most part is non-stormwater. We talk about stormwater permitting, but non-stormwater flowing off property and into a river, into the coastal areas is regulated just as much. And it's really the non-stormwater that we're concerned about as far as agriculture is concerned. We're looking mostly at irrigation runoff and what goes with it as far as ag is concerned, but there are other things that can also be of concern, like roof runoff, hardscape runoff, that sort of thing, especially when we haven't had rain for a very long time and you've collected a lot of junk on those locations. And when you get a good rain, then it can flow off and take that with it. And so that would be an issue with rain and carrying with it some stuff that is part of your growing operation that would be impacting the water quality. So the County of San Diego is the lead, and the cities and the Port District jointly hold a permit. So there are a number of each group that is part of this permit is called the co-permittee, and it has to uphold the conditions of the permit. The regional board is the local enforcement agency, but again, it passes the inspection duties down onto the permit holders. So in San Diego County, they have to address the issues with agricultural runoff and stormwater as it pertains to this law under some conditions, and definitely non-storm runoff. So the county has to do this. They do this through the Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures. So if you are a grower in the county, not in a city, but in the County of San Diego, you will likely be inspected by someone from Ag Weights and Measures for your stormwater compliance. It's not the same inspection that you have for pesticide use. It's also not the same inspection that you would have from the fire department for things like storage of toxic materials and that kind of thing. Usually the cost is, I don't know what the cost is at this point in time. It was $100. I'm sure it may have changed, but I'm not sure if there is an additional cost associated with this to have your inspection. You have to pay to be inspected. So if you are in a city For example, the city of Oceanside has its own inspections. They don't have the county ag commissioner's office do the inspections, even though the ag commissioner's office would be the ones that would inspect you as a grower for pesticide use. So they have their own environmental services department do the stormwater inspections. So you just have to be aware of who it is that's going to be doing that for you. So what does the stormwater permit require then? If you're a nursery producer, no irrigation water can leave your property. It must be held back in a reservoir and reused or disposed of in some other way. It can't flow into streams, storm drains, etc. So the storm drains and the channels along the sides of the roads and that sort of thing are all considered to be part of the storm drain program or the storm drain connections. And so ultimately that water flows into a larger water body with no treatment. And it's designed just to convey water. It's not designed to convey water and treat water. It's just designed to take water away from property. And so it's not treated. It's not treated or cleaned up in any way before it ends up in a stream or in the ocean or what have you. So that's why there's concern about this. Stormwater may not leave your property if it's mixed with irrigation runoff. So if you have an irrigation runoff pond and it rains a lot and it fills up with stormwater, you can't discharge that as though it is stormwater because it contains irrigation water also, the other things that are part of it. In some cases, new construction, a certain amount of each storm, such as maybe 1/4 of an inch, must be held back to avoid flushing pollutants into the waterways. So basically, if you have a rainstorm, even though normally stormwater would be allowed to leave your property, there are times when a certain percentage of that, let's say the first 1/4 inch of rain, must be held back and held into some kind of a basin so that you can not allow it to flow into the waterway. It takes a lot of stuff with it when it does flow into the waterway. Okay, so that requires annual inspections. Now I talked about irrigation runoff, but there's also water that I would consider more or less operational water, and that would be things from washing machinery. That would be water from doing things like activities like washing machinery and doing other things on your farming or your nursery operation that aren't directly related to irrigation, but are related to running your business. And that water is just the same as irrigation water when it comes to not letting it flow off your property. So that water also has to be retained and can't be let go off of your property. Okay, so if you have an inspection, what then are the inspectors going to be looking for? They'll be looking for site and emergency information. They'll be looking for employee training. And again, I think Dr. Spinelli is going to talk a little bit more about this. They'll be looking to see if you have an annual facilities review, what you do about hazardous materials. Initially in our program, we made sure that everybody had a spill kit on their farm, and that was helpful as far as meeting the requirements of the rules. And that's still a good piece of advice. It's a requirement that you have a spill kit in case you do have a spill and it could possibly get into the waterways. The regulatory folks really like for you to have a spill kit, and you can contain your spills much more easily that way. Waste management. What do you do with your waste management? How do you manage your waste on your farm? Vehicles and equipment. For a period of time, there was a lot of review of how vehicles and equipment were stored and how they were cleaned, and whether or not they were stored in an area where any kind of leaking oil or that sort of thing could get into the waterways. And so that's another thing to be aware of. How do you manage your outdoor areas? How do you manage your pesticide use? Pesticide use is already very regulated. But putting that into your information with regard to your water quality management is a good idea also. Nutrient and fertilizer use have probably gotten the most scrutiny, and managing your nitrogen and any other kind of fertilizer material so that it does not flow into the streams and the beaches and the coastal areas is really important as far as meeting the requirements of these rules. And then runoff management, of course, is key to all of this, because if you can manage your runoff, you will not have issues with most of the rest of these things. One of the interesting things is that as we've gotten to a position where we have less water and people are a little bit more cautious about water use as time has gone on, and they're more frugal about water use, we've had less and less issues with runoff management, and we've had less issues with a lot of these things. So having less water and having less water to allow to run off of your property is very helpful, actually, from a, it's not necessarily helpful as a grower from, you know, not having enough water, but it does really minimize some of these problems that we have with regard to runoff. All right. The Irrigated Lands Group and the Ag Waiver Program. Just to be very clear about this, my guess is that most of you are aware of what this means and how this came about at this point in time, because it's been in place for quite a while. But prior to the Irrigated Lands Group and the Agricultural Waiver Program that we had now, there was an agricultural waiver of reporting water quality numbers for irrigation water runoff. This is not the same as allowing growers to pollute. It just didn't have to report, the growers just didn't have to report water quality testing results to the regional board. So the waiver wasn't of polluting. You didn't have a waiver and that allowed you to pollute. You had a waiver that you didn't have to report your water quality numbers to the regional board. And there were a lot of reasons for this. If you're going to report these numbers to the regional board has to have a way to manage that. And that was just not possible for a period of time. And then it became much more of a statewide effort that all of these waivers had to be upgraded. The ag waiver is a conditional waiver, which means that you can add conditions to it. So the ag waiver, where you just didn't have to report your water quality numbers for irrigation water runoff, changed because conditions were added to it. Now there's a requirement for reporting. And that's where we are today, but it's also matured a little bit past that. Our current situation, every grower who meets certain conditions that determine they are commercial growers have to enroll in the Regional Water Quality Control Board's Ag Waiver Monitoring Program. I need to be really clear with this. That is a requirement of all growers. Enrolling in the Regional Board's Regional Water Quality Control Board's Ag Waiver Monitoring Program is not the same thing as enrolling in an irrigated lands group. So every grower has to report the quality of water in areas affected by runoff from his or her farm. This can be done as a group, like your San Diego Irrigated Lands Group that we're here talking with today. It's definitely the most cost effective, or individually. If you want to do this individually and do all your own monitoring, you can do that, but it's going to cost you a tremendous amount of money. The cost depends on the size of your farm and when you join. So, okay, so if you choose to do this with a group, this is the place where we need to clarify this. You will be enrolled in the regional board's monitoring program by your group. So you don't have to do that independently. So the Irrigated Lands Group will enroll you in the monitoring program as required by the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board. And it'll take care of all water quality monitoring. It'll provide all required reporting to the regional board, and it'll keep you informed of any changes, additional requirements, etc. For example, if this monitoring finds an additional pollutant or a higher level of pollutant than is acceptable and they have to do additional monitoring, your group will come back to you and say, we need to do some additional monitoring. It's required by the regional board. So they will keep you up to date on all of that. So basically what you have to do is enroll with your Irrigated Lands Group. Doesn't have to be the San Diego Irrigated Lands Group. There's a second one in the Upper Santa Margarita area. If you're in that area, you can enroll in that one. You can enroll in either one, or you can go it on your own. Regardless of that, it makes a lot more sense to join the group, because it's very cumbersome to do it on your own and very expensive, as I mentioned before. So basically, it's not okay to do nothing. You are required to monitor and you're required to report. Okay, so there are also educational requirements for the ag waiver. You have your 2 hours per year in San Diego County. This is what we're doing today, is your 2-hour education. Your online education is acceptable, but it has to be okayed by the regional board. And again, Dr. Spinelli will talk a little bit more about some opportunities for that when it's his turn to talk. So, all right. I don't know why this keeps jumping ahead. Okay, water quality materials from UCC San Diego. This will be shown in his presentation also. Additional water quality laws and regs training from a number of sources, including the UCANR catalog of ag-related publications, is also available. Be very aware that it's good to know what's going on in your own specific region, because that is what will be, those are the implications that you will have as far as managing your water quality in your own area. So with that, I promised I would talk for 45 minutes and then leave some time for questions. And so I am happy to answer any questions anybody has. You can put it in the chat if you want to. Or you can raise your hand. And I'll see if I can find you. Okay, first question is, can I give an example of where you would have to retain a 1/4 inch of a stormwater? So if you're going to be required to retain a 1/4 inch of stormwater, for example, that would come along with some kind of a project that you are putting in place. Let's say you're building a new greenhouse facility and it's got a certain amount of hardscape associated with it. The hardscape would have a likelihood of accumulating oil and grease, and if you don't get much rain for a period of time, there can be a decent amount of accumulation of oil and grease. And so if you take the amount of hardscape and you look at the surface area of the amount of hardscape, and you can do the calculation to figure out just how much water you would have to hold back and not let it get into the waterway, then you can come up with, say, a 1/4 inch, the first 1/4 inch of rain over, say, an acre. Figure out that that's what you would have to hold back. Does that kind of make sense? It's basically on a project to project basis. So first 1/4 inch would probably have to do more with the size of the project that you were implementing and whether or not you can, the likelihood that you would have some kind of a runoff issue with that project that would ultimately cause degradation of the water quality. It's not going to be, as far as I know, I have not seen this happen unless there's something changing with your operation and you're implementing a newer project, for example, or building something new or paving a huge parking lot or something like that. It's not going to just all of a sudden be placed upon you that you have to retain a 1/4 inch of water. I mean, it's probably associated with some kind of a permit that you go for. Okay. All right. Are there any laws regarding water infiltrating into the soil? Great question. So yes, there are laws, and there is some discussion about having to line your ponds so water doesn't infiltrate into the soil. There are specific laws for groundwater protection. And a lot of this has to do with whether or not your water is being used for drinking water. And there are, again, specific rules for that. But yes, there are definitely rules about water infiltrating into the soil, but it is generally, it depends on what's in, if the water is problematic and it's degrading the water in the groundwater. I can't give you a real clear-cut answer to that. Water infiltrating into the soil also is a way of saving water, where you can take water that would normally be flowing off of your property and put it back into the soil so that it can be used again and go back into your groundwater. This was done in the wine grape growing areas in Northern California during the years that we had so much rain. But at that point in time, we had, pretty much washed things off. So yes, the answer to that is yes, there are laws regarding water infiltrating into the soil if you're carrying with it something that should not be going back into the groundwater, okay? How do we find out what's supposed to be in a spill kit? Dr. Spinelli brought a spill kit today. He's actually going to demonstrate this for you. So you can, sure. So yeah, so you'll find out what's in there. I don't know if that's something where you have more information about that on your website. You may. So when he talks, he can show you your spill kit, okay? All right, other questions? Anybody else have a question? I know all these rules and everything can be a little bit boring, but it's kind of good to grasp the historical aspects of this and see just how far down the road we've gone with a lot of this. So, okay. Anything else? Tasha, have I missed any questions?
You have not. Thank you. Been very thorough.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and Dr. Spinelli is going to get set up. So if you want to take a real short break, we'll be back in about 5 or 10 minutes for his half of the presentation. Okay. Thank you. All right.
And if you can't hear me, and we are recording this, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Dr. Mellano. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity. And I am gonna go ahead a little bit with the discussion, and there will be some overlap with what Valerie, Dr. Mellano just said. So I'm gonna, forgive me if I'm gonna say some things that she said already, but I'm just gonna give you my flavor. You'll hear the same things with in the Italian sauce. And so I put here some pictures of the challenges that I see out there associated with water quality. So you see this porta potty here, where this secondary containment, this structure that the porta potty is sitting on, and you see all this nasty blue liquid that was collected there. And if there was no secondary containment, maybe it would have gone into the creek, maybe would have rained on it. And here you see this big trench, this big ditch with a lot of runoff, and you can see that there was erosion. So a lot of this sediment was picked up by the water, and maybe it ended up in the creek. It could have ended up as pollution in the creek. Another picture here is a lined pond with a lot of nutrients, probably because you see all these plants and all these algae growing there. So these are the challenges that I see out there, and my job is I'm an advisor for the nursery and for the flower industry here in San Diego County. And my expertise is water, irrigation, and water quality. So in this presentation, I'm gonna try and stay high level, and I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of irrigation. But if you are a nursery grower or a flower grower, I'll be happy to get into that rabbit hole with you. And so please reach out to me to talk about that. So as a grower, what are your responsibilities? You have to be aware of the problems associated with water pollution, and you need to be aware of the practices that you can establish, that you can use in order to manage and to improve the water quality and to minimize runoff. So water use and runoff, of course, the irrigation management and how much irrigation runoff is produced by your operation are strictly related, but there are also other issues like pesticide management or fertilizer management that strongly affect what kind of pollutants are going in your stormwater runoff and in your non-stormwater runoff. And we have a self-assessment that I'm gonna talk about in a minute that kind of helps you walk through all the things that are in your operation and and kind of pinpoint what the weak spots are. You also have to maintain records of your practices, of your water quality management practices, and we'll talk about it later too. You are responsible for training your employees on water quality, and we'll show you resources about that. You must take 2 hours of continuing education per year, and congratulations, because today you're taking 2 hours. So if you're still awake, you are taking 2 hours of education. Even if you're not still awake, you're still taking 2 hours of education this year. And also we want to make that 100% clear. You must enroll both in the ag order and in the monitoring program, the regional water quality control board monitoring program And typically you would do that through the irrigated land group. And if you're here, probably you're part of the irrigated land group already. And the idea is that somebody has to go there and take a sample in the creek, or take a sample in the river, or take a sample in a ditch where a lot of farms are in the same area. And so they can say, okay, we found this much phosphorus in this creek, we found this much nitrate in this ditch, we found these pesticides in this ditch. And so they can say, well, okay, these farms, this area are associated, are draining there. So that's what the whole point of monitoring is. And this is public data that is then available for everybody. It goes to some kind of database, and that's what kicks in the TMDLs that Dr. Mellano was talking about. So again, briefly, what are the regulations in San Diego County that you have to follow? So you have to be enrolled in the ag order, and anybody that is an ag business, and everybody that intends to make money as an ag business. So if I have another job, right? I work for the university, but if tomorrow I grow a tomato in a tomato plant in a pot at my house on my balcony, and I grow 2 tomatoes, and one I eat, and the other one I go to the farmer's market and I try to sell it for $1 and I do not sell it, still I have to be enrolled in the ag order. So if you intend to make money through agriculture, whether it's ornamental agriculture, whether it's vegetables, whether it's citrus or avocados, whatever it is, you have to be enrolled in the ag order. So this is definitely a requirement. And then, as part of being enrolled of the ag order with the regional board, you will have to write a paper, to fill out a form that is called the water quality protection plan. So basically, you are declaring that you plan to do all these things. You're declaring that you plan to implement a number of practices to your farm, to your property, that will protect the water quality. So we're gonna put these straw wattles there. We're gonna put these silt fences there. We're gonna improve our irrigation system management. We're gonna build this big pond that collects the water. We're gonna buy a system that repumps the water out of it and uses it to irrigate my landscape. Or maybe I'm gonna inject some chlorine and to sterilize that water, and then I'm gonna reuse it as irrigation water. Whatever you wanna do, whatever you plan on doing to protect water quality, it has to be written there. And it's not like a piece of paper that is a formality and just like, okay, I've written, I've sent it, I've signed it, and that's it. It's something that they will refer back to. They will refer back to it when you get an inspection, and is also something that you refer to when you do your self-inspection, and then you have to do an annual report on all these practices. So this is the requirement for the regional board. But also, as Dr. Mellano was saying, the regional board is the state, and they kind of pass down some responsibility to local jurisdictions. And by jurisdictions, I mean the county and the various cities and all these entities that are called co-permittees, and also the Port of San Diego is one of them, etc. I'm going to show you a list of all these co-permittees in a minute, but their job is to make sure that you and I do not discharge anything else than water in the so-called MS4, which is not a street gang. It means the storm drains, but they call them MS4 for some reason. It means separate storm sewer system, and it's the it's the storm drains, ditches, roads, every kind of water conveyance that you can have. The local jurisdictions are tasked to regulate what is being discharged in those structures, because those structures then drain to the creek, to the river, and to the ocean. So anything that gets discharged there then creates pollution or affects wildlife, etc. These are the list of jurisdictions here. As you can see, county, city of Lemon Grove, city of National City, city of San Marcos, etc. And you can scan this code here, and we'll take you to this website where you can see who is your jurisdiction of reference, and you can reach out to them to ask them questions. The easiest way to summarize the regulations for water quality in San Diego are these two catchy phrases. So as far as irrigation water or any kind of non-storm water water that you have, that non-storm water runoff that is generated in your operation, it has to stay in your property. So if there is a lot of it, typically you will deal with it by collecting it in a pond. But then the problem becomes, what do I do with this water, right? My pond at a certain point fills up, and it will spill over into the creek again. So then you just move the problem somewhere else. So then typically you will have to implement some kind of managed practice for these ponds. So you will have to pump the water out of it and get rid of this water somehow. You will have to make sure that the pond doesn't get filled with silt or with sediment. So every year you have to go there and clean it. You may build a sediment trap before the pond just to get rid of all that sediment, so your pond doesn't get filled with sediment, etc. Also, we're talking about groundwater pollution, and more recently, the county is requiring for the ponds to be lined. It's a little bit of a gray area that is not extremely clear, but what I see out there is that the ponds are being lined. So this is being required by the county. The storm water can leave your property, but it can only be rain. It can only be rain. It cannot bring with it any pollutant, any material. And so the catchy phrase there is only rain in the storm drain. But now the problem is that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to achieve this, particularly in a climate like in San Diego, where we have a very long dry season, where a lot of material, a lot of sediment, a lot of debris, a lot of junk can accumulate. And then the first storm, that will be a big flash where all this stuff again ends up in the creek. Like I put here in this ditch, you can see this chocolate cake looking water that brings a lot of sediment with it. So no sediment, no nitrate, no pesticides, no other pollutant. If you're in the nursery industry, you probably use substrate peat or cocoa based substrate for your plants. That cannot be in the water either. So there will be a lot of practices, of preventative practices, that you have to have before the storm comes, to avoid that this water carries with it all these pollutants. This is my personal classification of pollutants, but that is also related on how you deal with them. And there is some kind of pollutants that are typically attached to sediment, like in this pond here, where you can see it's like chocolate brown color. It means that water is carrying a lot of sediment. It picks up sediment somehow on its way to the pond, and phosphorus has very low solubility in water, and so it remains attached to the soil. And so typically, to manage phosphorus, you will try to get rid of sediment. But in getting rid of sediment, you will get rid of phosphorus. And the same is for pesticides that are not very soluble in water, like pyrethroids. Pyrethroids are very insoluble in water, and so to get rid of pyrethroids in your runoff, you do that by getting rid of your of the sediment that is in the water. In this example here on the right hand side, you see these ponds that the grower have built, and they're sedimentation ponds. So the water gets into this pond and sits there. So the sediment settles out of solution, and then it spills over to the next pond, and so on. So these are ways to get rid of that sediment. And then the other category of pollutants are soluble pollutants, and the king of them is nitrate, which is an extremely soluble molecule. And also some new generations of pesticides, including neonicotinoids. Those are very soluble. So to get rid of that, of those materials, you just have to collect the water somehow. And then we touched on this already. The pollutants can go to surface water with runoff, like in this picture, somebody's irrigating up here, and this irrigation system is creating a lot of runoff, and this runoff goes into the manhole, and then from the manhole, maybe we'll go into a pond, but maybe the pond is full, and so it will spill over and will go into the creek. And so maybe the day before, this plant had been treated, and so there is some pesticide in that, some insecticide in that water, and goes into the creek, and it kills some fish or some wildlife or some shrimp or something, some aquatic wildlife. So the runoff that goes in surface water typically has a high flow rate, and it happens intermittently. Instead, groundwater, it's something that groundwater pollution will happen through infiltration from a pond, and so that will happen at slower flow rate, because water takes a longer time to infiltrate, and there are a lot of factors involved, including the soil type and the size of the pond, etc. But it will happen for a longer time, right? Because the pond is there 24/7, so it's lower, but it sits there always. And then the difference between stormwater and irrigation runoff. Stormwater is something that happens in a very short time, particularly in San Diego, right? We're not in Scotland where it rains for 3 days straight, and it's at a very low precipitation rate. Our rains are very concentrated. Maybe it starts raining on a Thursday at 2 a.m. and it rains until 4:30, and then the next day we wake up and all we can see is the erosion that runoff created. But we didn't even see that rains. And this graph here is something that is called a hydrograph, and it shows the amount of the volume of the flow rate in time. And so you have this big flush, and the flow rate is 0, and then it increases very steeply, and then it goes back down again. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to manage. And so management for stormwater runoff is mostly focused on prevention and on preparation. And here I put this picture with this water catchment system. They are also called, the NRCS calls them roof runoff structure. So you can collect the water from your impervious surfaces, including hardscape, including roofs, and you can convey it maybe into an underground pipeline. So that way, it's a way of getting rid of that water that is, since it drained into your property, is your responsibility. But if you put it in a pipeline, then you get rid of it before it gets an opportunity to run on your landscape and pick up any pollutant. So a prevention, it's a passive strategy, it's a prevention strategy that is very effective. So to avoid that it picks up sediment, substrate, fertilizer, and all this stuff, all this nasty stuff that I listed here. Conversely, the irrigation runoff will have flows that are constant and low. So maybe they're irrigating this block on the right-hand side, and here on this ditch on the side of the road you have this runoff, but maybe how many gallons per minute are those? Maybe 50. And so then you can connect that ditch to a retention pond, and maybe you can pump out of the pond at the same rate that your irrigation runoff gets into the pond. And so then you will be at a steady state that is more manageable. So then those 50 gallons per minute, you're gonna repump into your irrigation system and treat them somehow, maybe inject chlorine, maybe inject ozone. There are various technologies, and then reuse it with your irrigation system. So it's something that is a lot easier to deal with, to capture and to treat. Okay, now I would like to point you towards some resources that are out there. These are website, the San Diego Cooperative Extension website. I put a code here that you can scan with your phone. This is what the website looks like. And you have this menu, and the first menu item is agriculture. So if you click on it, you will see this menu that shows up, this drop-down menu, and one of the item is ag water quality. So we have this ag water quality website, and I put here the code too that you can scan, and if you don't want to scan it, this is the link down here, and it will kick you to this website on the right hand side. And there are a number of resources there, and one of them is the self-assessment, and then another one is the training modules in English and in Spanish. I mentioned earlier that you're responsible for training your employees. These are where the resources for training your employees are. And the self-assessment is a PDF that you can print out and put in a clipboard, and then you use it to walk around your operation. And it's kind of a checklist. And we have 3 of them. One for greenhouse and nurseries, one for tree operation, and one for animal operations. And it's a little lengthy, but the objective here is making sure that you have thought about everything possible that you need to manage in your operation. And it's also something that is a very good tool to prepare yourself for an inspection. So the worst situation where you want to find yourself is where the inspection comes and there is something that is not on your radar, that you haven't thought about, that you haven't had time to manage. So just taking 30 minutes to go through this self-assessment allows you to ask yourself the right questions and to make sure that everything that can apply to you, some other things will not apply to you, but everything that applies to you, you are taking care of, or at least is on your radar. So yeah, so there are different versions depending on what kind of operation you are. And then finally, also on this page, we have this ag water quality record keeping, because one of your responsibilities there, as I mentioned, is to keep records of what you're doing, keep record of where your pesticides are, where your fertilizer are, what are you doing to manage them. So this is an example of the first page of one self-assessment. And so it will ask you questions like, does irrigation operation runoff during dry weather stays on your property, which is what I mentioned earlier. But it's kind of a summary it's kind of a summary of all these things, and you have them all in one place, and it gets to a good amount of detail with these questions, and you will simply say, okay, this doesn't apply to me, or you will say yes or no. And if you said no, then you know that it's something, depending on the question, you know that it's something that you need to find a solution for. This is an example of the record keeping. It's a PDF that is about 10 or 15 pages, and is divided in sections. So section 2 is hazardous materials, and section 5 is fertilizers, and then there's another one for tractors and the machines and equipment, and then there's another one for pesticides. But basically, with these tables, it's a way for you to keep everything in one place and keep track of what has been done to manage these various items that then the inspectors are going to ask about. So having everything in one place, having this record keeping system in one place where then you can feed other information is something very useful. Okay. So these are the other item on the menu for the employee trainings. Here I put the codes too, or you can go simply to the water quality website and click on training modules in English and training modules in Spanish, and they are divided in various chapters. So you'll have a chapter about hazardous materials, and you will have another chapter about equipment and vehicles, etc. Or you can download the first line is the PDF, and it will download the whole training material. But then you have something to train, to organize trainings for your employees, so they're on the same page. And again, this is one of your responsibilities as a grower. I also have my website. I work with nursery and floriculture operations in San Diego. So again, if you go to our website and under agriculture, instead of ag water quality, you click on floriculture and nursery, you will end up on my website, and I keep it updated all the time. And so you click on the website and you see all these Jerry's here, and this one is talking about sprinklers, and I'm testing some sprinklers, and there in that video I say, okay, this sprinkler is more efficient than the other one. And if you click on the irrigation menu, then you will have access to a lot of videos, and you will get into a rabbit hole, and before you know, I'm there talking about some equation that you need to calculate distribution uniformity, and it gets very technical very quickly. So or here I'm showing a graph about the relationship between flow rate and pressure in a pump, etc. So talk to me if you get lost, but there is a lot of material here that is relevant to understand a lot of concept with irrigation, and everything that you can do to improve your irrigation practices downstream, literally downstream, will create a smaller problem for management of your runoff. And then I have another section for water quality within the floriculture and nursery website. And here, for example, I have a video of Dr. Lauren Oki from UC Davis, that is an expert in nurseries, and he's talking about slow sand filters that are a cheap technology to treat runoff water. After you collected it in your pond, you can repump it into this slow sand filter, and it gets treated, and then you reuse it for irrigation. And many other videos and many other technical videos on water quality are there. Again, other management practices for water quality for nurseries. Here I have a video on how to manage runoff. Here I have a video on distribution uniformity, etc. to fulfill your requirement of your 2 hours of education like you're doing today, you can go on the Irrigated Land Group website and go on the annual education. And here you will see, again, you will see Jerry again, and the number of other presenters, including my friend Christina, and you can watch those videos there. And then at the end of the video, you have to fill out a form, and that will qualify for your 2 hours of education. So today we're giving this presentation, but if you have to fulfill the requirement one time that we are not giving it, you can go on the website and see the recording, and this presentation will also be recorded and will be on that website. And here again, I put the code that you can scan. And finally, the County of San Diego that takes care of the water quality enforcement in all the unincorporated area. So everything else in San Diego County that is not City of Escondido, City of Oceanside, City of San Diego, etc., all the unincorporated area that tends to be kind of around the more populated area is under the jurisdiction of the County of San Diego, and specifically their Ag Water Quality Program. And they have a website with a number of resources for stormwater and non-stormwater runoff management, and there's a lot of resources there. So I encourage you to go on their website, and here I put the code. And one of the various resources that they have there is this stormwater annual review record, where you can go there, and again, it's another checklist that allows you to make sure that the your management practices or of your area that are in your areas that are important from a stormwater management point of view are how they're doing. So they allow you to walk through every year and say, okay, all the practices that I have, do they need maintenance? Do they still work? Are they still there? Do they need improvement? Do they need to be taken care of? So this is another tool that you can use. And with this, thank you very much. I want to show you the spill kit, but also I encourage you to take this survey. I put another code here. It's basically for us to report to the people above us, to show them that we did a good job, or maybe that we didn't, I don't know. But it's the only way that we can show that we did what we did. And also here's my contact information. And so if you work with nurseries or with floriculture, please reach out to me, and I will show up in your ranch with 2 big ranches, and I'll start doing things like I'm doing in this picture. And then, but before I say goodbye, this is what you call a spill kit. This is what you call a spill kit. It's a bucket that you keep in your operation, and it's something that you need ready before something bad happens. So it's some kind of preventative strategy that you know that you're ready for when you will spill some diesel, or when you will spill some liquid pesticide, or when you will spill some nasty material. And the objective is avoid that nasty material ends up in the manhole, or ends up in the water water cycle. So the most obvious things that the most natural thing that we want to do when we spill some nasty stuff on the ground is getting the hose and clean it up. And that's because water gives us a sense of cleanliness. But actually, you should do quite the opposite. And so you always need to use some dry methods. to clean up these spills. And so you always need to use brushes and brooms and you need, and so the spill kit means having these buckets with what's inside, but also having a broom and having a dustpan and having some kind of brush to collect this material. And the most important thing that you need to have in your spill kit is some absorptive material. This is litter for cats, but you can also use sawdust, or there is some similar material in the automotive industry that is specifically designed to suck in motor oil, to absorb motor oil. So you wanna pour some dry absorptive material on the spill so it absorbs it, and then you wanna brush it or use a broom to collect it in a dustpan. Then when you put it in the dustpan, you have to put it in a bag, in a plastic bag. It's a simple plastic bag, and you want to make sure that it's closed, that you seal it very well. And so what you want to have in your spill kit is also zip ties. I hope you can see the zip tie. So you want to zip tie your bag, making sure that it's very well and securely closed, and nothing can get out of it. And then you need a marker, because you want to write on it whichever nasty material you put in there. You want to make sure you tell them what it is. And then of course you'll need goggles, and then of course you need masks, and then of course you need gloves. But again, the most important thing is that you have a broom and the brush and the dustpan, and that you remember that the method, the cleaning method, always needs to be a dry one, a dry cleaning method. With this, I think we have plenty of time for questions.
So I'll just come over and we'll both have the camera, I guess.
And we're both available.
If you want to put your questions in the chat, that'd be great.
Uh-oh.
There you go. Want to address that? So the first question is, a lot of this is redundant with good ag practices. Would be good if they would coordinate their record formats. Yeah, I can't agree more.
I agree.
The record keeping formats that we put together are from our original efforts, and there's nothing keeping us from updating any of this stuff. But yes, that would be reasonable. One of the things that we did when we put the record keeping program together was we tried to make it possible to not double up and have to do the same work over again. So for example, if you have pesticide use reports, you don't need to redo that and write down everything or type in everything you used. You just take your pesticide use reports and you slip them in, or you scan them and you put them in, and you have them. It's just having them all in one spot, which was really important when you would have an inspection. So, but certainly we could definitely change those things up quite a bit. It's time for updates for sure. How often do you need to train your employees? Yearly?
I would say yearly.
Yeah. Most people that did it would train them. If they'd have a weekly or a monthly meeting of their employees, they'd pick a couple topics and go over them. It takes literally 5 to 10 minutes to cover a topic, honestly, with the materials that are there. So, okay.
To get rid of the bad stuff, I know that the county has a hazardous material disposal service, and they also have some recurring, you can go there, events where you can go there and dispose of old pesticides that there is no other way that you can dispose of. So the ag department, the county ag department will help you with that.
If you try to do it on your own, it can be kind of expensive, but if you wait till there's an ag collection day or a hazardous materials collection day, then you can generally deposit it pretty inexpensively. Keeping it contained in those plastic bags and zip tied shut is relatively safe. I mean, it's not going anywhere at that point. So sometimes you can throw it away, but for the most part, no.
The secondary containment, as far as I know, is required by the county. So the county inspectors will ask you to have secondary containment. For example, if you have some diesel tanks, they want you to have secondary containment around it. If you have like all the porta potties, they ask you to have secondary containment around them. So yeah, the county requires it. The inspectors of the county require that you have secondary containment.
Anything else? There's the inspection record retention requirement.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
So these are good questions for the inspectors. I wish we had one of them here.
So are you talking about like the record keeping system and how many years of records you have to put in there? I would think just one. You're getting reviewed every year.
Every year,
Yeah. So I would think it would be just one. Honestly, when the inspectors would come out and look at your property, what they were looking for is improvement and, you know, planning ahead and figuring out a way to do better. I don't know if anybody was perfect. I know initially a lot of people got dinged because they didn't have spill kits on hand. And so that's why we started giving everybody a spill kit. But I think a year would probably be sufficient. I mean, you're going to have a lot of those records anyway for a longer period of time. And some of the records like the pesticide use reports and all that are in the system, regardless of whether you keep them. So if they're looking at an annual report, I think you need to tell them what you did in this past year.
Lawrence, you raise your hand.
Yes. My question is a little bit unusual in that we live in an agricultural preserve area, A72, but we've had a family that built, supposedly it was only going to be a family race course just for their son, but it expands now, and we have things with the county about how much grading they're doing, and the fact that they've now created an area of 15 acres of dirt constantly done, and they use water trucks, and they run water trucks over these things for these jumps. And I'm wondering, why doesn't this follow under irrigated land or irrigated here in our area, that they wouldn't be complied to water quality? They have motorcycles running, they have a huge amount of dirt being moved and constantly putting water, and it's high quality water from wells. How doesn't that fall into the same kind of category as any agricultural procedure? It's a farm. I mean, it's the farm, unfortunately, it's a racetrack. And I just wonder, wouldn't that follow under water quality?
It would. So first of all, it'd probably fall under the planning and land use grading requirements and ordinances. And I mean, if they're going to do that, they'd have to get a permit to do it. My guess is they didn't do that, but I can't say that for sure. But as far as the water is concerned, because it's not ag, I mean, they're not growing and selling anything that wouldn't be considered ag, but it can certainly have the same implications. So I think that, what's that?
I guess the other thing is that they said they were a family thing, but they're doing things like the X game, where they're actually doing a lot of commercial thing there. And they're bringing on motorcycles, they're bringing on all kinds of other things. And those are going to pollute the soil and and they're running water as though any farm, more water than most farmers use. And it's high quality water. Shouldn't they require to at least using, lower quality water, like recycled water or something like that?
I honestly, all that makes sense to me, but I'm not sure what they have gotten permission to do. But, they might not have recycled water available to them either. If that's, you have to have that available and piped to you. So my guess is nobody's complained about it to the county.
No, we complain.
Yeah.
There's a
Okay.
big contention going on. And my question is, made me think about it, of all the things that we're doing with farming, we're in an agricultural area, and yet it's being used as though it were an agricultural, because they're gaining money off it, they're making profit off of it. And at the same time, they're using a lot of water. And yes, I know they've had to do a few little minor things to keep it running off their property, but I don't think it's very massive. Wouldn't it follow under underwater quality? That's my question. How would I go about finding out about that?
I think this is above my pay grade, but I think that since they're not growing plants, then they're not subject to the agricultural rules. But on the other hand, if you're moving, like the county has strong regulations on construction. And I think that the stormwater department, not the ag department, but the stormwater department has a lot of rules for people that do construction, right? I'm building a retention wall here, I'm moving a lot of dirt there, and there are a lot of regulations. So if it rains on this dirt that I just moved, then it goes to the creek and also it's pollution. So now you have to hydroseed it, or again, put straw wattles or silt fences and all those things. So there are regulations from the county that are not that are for different industries than the ag industry, that are for the similar, to protect water quality too.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of having, when you build a house and you're grading and you have to put up silt fencing to keep all the silt from running off, that's similar. I mean, there's a lot of water used then too, but it's similar use, but it's certainly not under the ag water quality program. But Jerry's right, it's like another similar end result, but it's monitored and regulated under a different program. And probably the not environmental health, but the land use and planning land use department would be the most likely place to go, because they can put a lot of restrictions on various activities like that if they need to.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Pleasure.
Follow up on some of these other issues with water quality.
Anybody else? Good. All right, if no one else has questions, we're all set. And thank you very much for listening in today. Hope it helps you out. Got your 2 hours. That's good. So, Tasha, anything else we need to do?
No, thank you both very much, Doctors Valerie Mellano and Jerry Spinelli. We appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for participating, everyone. Have a great afternoon.